I'll make this brief so that we can hear Mr. Mary. He's a senior associate at the American Foreign Policy Council, a private educational foundation in Washington, D.C., established in 1982. He's had a 26-year career in the United States Foreign Service, 6 years of it in Moscow as a specialist in Soviet and Russian politics. He has written for an amazing number of publications, has been interviewed by every major media outlet in the United States and probably abroad. He studied at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and then at the Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. His topic, Russia under Putin, is very timely given the election in Russia that's going to happen on Sunday, an election that will have virtually no outside observers. And he took a little exception to that last, so we'll let Mr. Mary talk. Thank you.
I was told that many people came out this evening because of an interest in Putin. That's too bad, because I'm not going to talk about him, at least not until the Q&A session. I want to talk about broader issues about Russia and perceptions of Russia, because as somebody who spent most of my professional life either in Russia or studying Russia or dealing with Russia in various capacities, I think we need to do some serious re-examining of how people think about it. And so I want to challenge a few of the conventional wisdoms about Russia today. And the first of these is the notion that Russia is a country in a post-Soviet transition. No, forget that. Transition's been over now for about 8 years. What you see now is what you're going to get for a long time to come. The transition ended in some ways with the currency crisis of 1998. It decisively ended with the transfer of power from Yeltsin to Putin. This is not a transitional regime in any sense of the word. What you have in Russia today is the assumption of power in a very broad sense of a new ruling generational elite. And we focus far too much on individuals. I think that what we're looking at now would not be much different if Yeltsin's successor had been Kiriyenko or Stepashin or Primakov or any number of other people it might have been. The personality of Vladimir Putin is not trivial, but I think it is quite secondary to this broader transfer of power to a new ruling elite. One of the best Russian studies I've seen on this subject estimates that this new elite is composed of roughly 6,000 people. And that strikes me as about the right order of magnitude. Now, obviously, the complete elites of a country the size of Russia are much larger than that. But what we're essentially talking about are a group of people who are more or less of the same generation, same kind of background in terms of education and training, but above all, of a shared outlook on what their country's problems are and what kind of country they want it to be, and who are in positions of authority, political, economic, and otherwise, to try to make those agendas come into being. These people are not democratic in any sense, I think, that we would recognize, nor are they really concerned with being so. They are, I think, however, people who are very reflective of the history of their country in the last 40 years. These are people whose formative years were under Brezhnev, the so-called period of stagnation, when the country was basically in drift. They came into their careers in the years of Gorbachev and became more senior in those careers under Yeltsin, periods when the Soviet Union was breaking apart and Russia was very weak. They have very strong consciousness of national pride. These are very patriotic people, very nationalist in many respects. They are not, I believe, in any way sort of neo-Soviet. And I think it's a big mistake to think about Russia today as somehow returning to the Soviet way of doing things. Their motivations are not ideological. They're not motivated by any notions of Marxism, Leninism. Their primary motivations are nationalistic. There are various expressions used to describe them. Often they're called siloviki because so many of them have backgrounds in the security services. But I think the term that is most correct to describe them is that they are derzhavniki. They are believers in a Russian concept, derzhavnost, which is impossible to translate into English because the Anglo-Saxon tradition has nothing like it. Derzhavnost is the concept of the greatness of the state and the dedication to the building the greatness of the state as the central goal of society, to which all other things are secondary, if not tertiary, and other things are sacrificed. And the commitment to the building of the greatness of the state. This is something that would have been very familiar in the time of Peter the Great, in the time of Catherine the Great, in the time of Nicholas I, in the time of Alexander III. This is not a Soviet concept. This is a traditional Russian concept. It's somewhat like French étatisme, only raised to a much sort of higher level of intensity. Derzhavnost in Russia today is particularly strong because of the shared experience of humiliation of the Soviet collapse and Russian weakness during the 1990s. Many people in Europe and the United States tend to look back on the Yeltsin period as kind of a paradigm of how Russia should behave, whereas these people look back on those years as an example of something which must never, ever, at any cost, be repeated. These are people who feel a very deep sense of pride in their country. These are also people who do not in any way appreciate being told that Russia needs to pursue a path to reform. They consider that they are reformers. In fact, they consider that they are successful reformers. What I would say is that they are lucky reformers, in that they have on their watch oil has gone from $20 a barrel to over $90 a barrel. So they have had the wherewithal to make their agenda real. If they were still dealing with $20 a barrel oil, I think it's fair to say that they would be much less cocky, they would be much less forceful, and they would be much less popular at home. When you've got that much money, there's a lot you could overcome a lot of shortcomings. I think in many respects what these people are reflecting is a Russian experience in the last 20 years, which was common for a lot of other European peoples earlier in the century, which is loss of empire, loss of great power status. Now, this happened to a number of countries in the aftermath of the First World War, a number of other countries in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's a very, very difficult, traumatic experience for a country that has been great, has been imperial, usually for hundreds of years, to lose that status. Any of you who know countries like Turkey, like countries like France, even countries like the Netherlands or Britain, will understand that this is a process which takes a long time to adjust to. The Russians are the last of the European powers to come to this experience. They're at the beginning of a learning curve, which other countries have been going through sometimes for 2 or 3 generations and still have not come to full acceptance. It's going to take time. However, I want to assure you that I see absolutely no prospect of a new Cold War with Russia. That is, unless we choose to initiate one. Because whatever else these people are, they're not gamblers. They're not irresponsible players on the global stage. And they are conscious of the fact that Russia has limited assets. A figure which is at the center of much of the Russian discussion of Russia's role in the world today is a man named Alexander Gorshakov, who was Russian foreign minister for a quarter of a century in the aftermath of Russia's defeat in the Crimean War. And Gorshakov's experience is one that is looked upon by many of the people who are running Russia today as an example of how a country which has been defeated, humiliated, no allies, can use its geography and its limited national assets in ways to maximize and multiply its influence in international affairs, to make itself important among other great powers even though it remains internally a very weak state. That's the example of Gorshakov. In Gorshakov's time, it was a saying in Russia that Russia only has two friends, its army and its navy. Today, many of the disciples of Gorshakov say that Russia today has only two friends, oil and gas. And Russia's use of its role as a hydrocarbon exporter has surprised a lot of people because they don't treat it as a purely commercial, mercantile, economic activity. They treat it as a political and geopolitical set of instruments. This is purely Gorshakovian. This is the Russian leadership looking at that which it has that is of influence, that gives it power, because they don't have much else other than geography, and trying to use those instruments to increase, to multiply Russia's influence and to make Russia be able essentially to punch above its weight in international affairs and to be influential beyond its intrinsic strengths and merits. Now, much of the way the Russian leadership looks at international affairs is by the standards, I think, of the world we all sort of know, and particularly of the world that the Europeans know, is somewhat archaic. And it comes as more of a shock to many of the Europeans than it should have. Because the basic Russian attitude, as expressed by a Russian analyst friend of mine, is the view that there are two kinds of countries in the world: rule makers and rule takers. And that during the 1990s, Russia became a rule taker country, and the West, and the United States in particular, abused its weakness, and that it is of critical importance that Russia resume its position as a rule maker state. The twin of this attitude is that there are really only a handful of truly sovereign countries in the world. Most countries aren't really sovereign. This is a view actually that most great powers would share. We'd never say it publicly, of course, but basically people in Washington and Beijing feel exactly the same thing. And that it is important that Russia be one of them. This says a lot about the way Russia interacts with its neighbors, with countries of the former Soviet Union, countries of former Eastern Europe, countries with which it could easily have much more favorable relations, but treats them as rule-taker countries, as not fully sovereign, because that is the way in which they define and perceive international relationships. Now, objectively, Russia's position between the European Union at one end of Eurasia and China at the other is that of a pygmy between two giants, of a comparative failure economically, other than as a hydrocarbon and other commodity exporting country, between two great economic success stories of very different kinds. What the Russians try to do is to use their geographic position and their relationships in both directions to try to maximize their influence. With the Europeans, they do it essentially by trying to divide the European states rather than dealing with the European Union as a collective whole. They try to deal with Germany on some issues and France on some issues, Britain, Italy on other issues. And they get away with that because there are European governments that are willing to do the same thing for their own reasons. And when the Europeans complain that the Russians are not behaving toward Europe according to what the Europeans think is the accepted rule book, I say to the Europeans that they have none but themselves to blame, because they let the Russians get away with this. They let the Russians play this game of dividing, say, Poland or Romania against the larger West European countries. And what the Europeans need to do if they want to have a more responsible relationship with Russia is learn to get their own house in order and deal as a collective rather than as a dysfunctional group in which the whole is less than the sum of the parts. China's a completely different story, of course. And the Chinese attitude toward the Russians is very instructive, because many people in Moscow still like to talk about Russia playing a China card. Well, I can tell you, people in Beijing know that if there's any card playing, They're the player. They're not the card anymore. And that the great power in Eastern Eurasia now is, of course, China. And the Chinese look at Russia in many respects as an example of mistakes that they did not make. But above all, the contrast between Russia and China is in their attitude towards involvement in the international system in general, towards globalization. The Russians tend to look at globalization as a threat and tend to be increasingly autarkic, inward-looking, viewing international engagement and foreign involvement in Russia as a threat of almost, sometimes in almost paranoid terms. The Chinese are very different. As a colleague of mine at Georgetown University says, the Chinese look at globalization as a heaven-sent opportunity to correct all the blunders of the Mao period. And that no country has benefited more in the last 30 years from globalization than China. And that while the Chinese are immensely patriotic and proud people, they also understand their own internal weaknesses and shortcomings, and that they have much to learn from the outside world, and that no country would suffer more from a breakdown of an open international system than China. In this respect, the Russians and the Chinese attitude toward engagement with the outside world is immensely different. Going to meetings in Moscow and going to meetings in Beijing is a totally different attitude. I mean, the Chinese have an openness, an engagement, and a candor that I have never encountered in Moscow. Now, in terms of its relations with some of its near neighbors, I think it's worth keeping in mind that many of the countries of the former Soviet Union, particularly those in Central Asia, but even some of the others like Belarus, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, are really rather comfortable in their dependency relationship with Russia today. Because that is a relationship which helps preserve the ruling elites in those countries in power. And this is nothing terribly unusual. It's not uncommon for former colonial powers to adhere to the former imperial power as a way for the new ruling elite in the former colony to maintain itself in power. I mean, a lot of the ex-French colonies in Africa do that, have done that with Paris. A lot of the former British colonies have done that with London. It's nothing unusual, because many of these ruling elites have no more legitimacy, certainly no democratic legitimacy, and certainly in some cases rather less than those of Russia. And they use their relationship with Russia for interests that are very much their own. And in many cases, these governments feel a lot more comfortable in their dealings with Moscow than they do in their dealings with Washington or with Brussels. A lot more comfortable. And even those countries, and I accept the Baltic states here because they're really quite different, but countries like Ukraine and Georgia that have very difficult relations with Moscow have ruling elites that are really not that much different than the Russian. I mean, I was recently in Georgia, and I would say that in many respects, many of the criticisms that we level at Russia today in terms of the state of democracy are equally legitimate in Georgia. It's just that those ruling elites happen to define their relations with Moscow today in adversarial terms rather than in cooperative terms. Now, the important thing about Russia is that despite this new sort of sense of its role in the world and this effort to restore the greatness of Russia, Russia remains a country much more defined by its weaknesses than by its strengths. And I think the extent and the depth of those weaknesses are often not very well understood. So I'm going to dwell on them a bit. There is frequently a tendency in the outside world to think that Russia's internal problems today are the result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is wrong. These are the long-term legacy of those forces which themselves brought on the breakup of the Soviet Union, that are the legacy of 7 decades of catastrophically bad policies in a whole range of areas, from including agriculture, where you have a country that used to be one of the breadbaskets of the world, that it still has critical problems, often in just being able to feed itself. In industry, where a country that used to spend 30% of GDP on the military still is not competitive in any form of exports of manufactured goods other than weaponry, even today. In areas like infrastructure, where you have an enormous amount of the infrastructure of Russia today, is in near collapse because it was shoddily built to begin with and then not properly maintained. Even in the area in which the Soviet Union was in many respects the strongest, in education, where in public education the country is in serious deterioration because the remuneration and conditions for people going into education are so bad that you're not getting a new generation of good young people going into teaching. So the education system there is pretty much living off of its hump. And obviously in areas of politics and civil society. When I say civil society, I use the classic definition that it's everything in a society between the state and the family. And in the Soviet period, the objective was to close that the state would occupy all of the space outside of the family. And what that has done is that has eviscerated the ability of the society to produce an active civil society, an active growth of organizations and patterns of behavior that are not under the monopoly of the state. And that remains still extremely weak. But the areas of greatest concern, and these are the ones I want to talk about the most, are in demographics and health. And I don't think many people in the West understand just how deeply sick a nation Russia is. And I want to emphasize that all the numbers I'm going to be using are official Russian numbers, which means in most cases they understate the problem. Demographically, Russia today is in the second spiral of a downward demographic collapse. Russian fertility rates started going down in 1981 under Brezhnev. This goes back a long way. Russian fertility rates by the end of the 1980s were at half replacement. Replacement rate is 2.1 births per woman. The Russian fertility rate is 1.1, one of the lowest anywhere in the world, the lowest of any developed country in the world. In the 1980s, the Russian part of the Soviet Union produced 2.5 million babies. Today they produce 1.5 million. Deaths exceeded live births in Russia in 1992. That was not because the Soviet Union broke up. That was because of tendencies that had been underway for years and even decades. This is not like a European country where, for example, in European Union, the country which has the weakest demographics is Italy, which has 103 deaths for every 100 births. The equivalent figure in Russia is 170. 170 people die for every 100 that are born. This is a country that's losing 750,000 people in its population every year. And what you're now having is the second generation of this downward demographic coming of age. What you're having is what should be the new generation of Russian parents, particularly women entering prime childbearing years, which was 19 to 29, who essentially were not born in the 1980s and 1990s, coming up to adulthood. What this means is that if you have fertility rates that are abnormally low, only half of replacement, and you have a smaller generation of people coming into parenthood, the next generation gets smaller and smaller and smaller. This is a spiral. And nothing changes it unless you can increase fertility rates. Dramatically increasing fertility rates is a very difficult thing for social policy to do, because it's fundamentally about people choosing to have children or to not have children. The reason fertility rates are so low in Russia is for a lot of reasons, but they fundamentally are about choice, and they're about health. They're about the health of people who become parents. And this deals with the health crisis. And Russia is different than the aging, the grain process that you hear about in Japan and in Europe. where you have low fertility rates and people all getting older. That's not what you get in Russia. In Russia, you have dramatically low fertility rates and people dying before they become old. Male life expectancy in Russia is 58 years. Among the countries of the world, that's number 136. Female life expectancy is number 100 in the world. Male life expectancy in Russia is in Central African levels. Central African levels. And the reason is because you have generations of working age people in Russia who are essentially committing systemic suicide. This is the leading killer in Russia is cardiovascular. It's because of alcohol, cigarettes, bad diet, bad lifestyle, no exercise, and chronic depression, which all lead to massive cardiac failure. Problem is not as bad for the women as for the men, but Russian men are essentially a suicidal working class. And I say that without meaning in any way to be amusing. It's literally true. What you also see in Russia are a series of disease problems that have no parallel in a developed country. They start in infancy with deficiencies in iodine, in vitamins, and in calcium. Many children born in Russia are already born iodine and calcium deficient. Standard childhood diseases in Russia are scurvy, rickets, rubella, and goiters. Goiters because table salt in Russia is not iodized. Basic vitamin deficiencies are common. Rubella is because families don't let their kids get their childhood shots because the parents are afraid of infection from reused needles. And they're right. Russian Ministry of Health says 70% of needles in hospitals are reused. What this means is the kids grow up sick. The Russian Army judges that only 11% of the young men it conscripts are physically fit by the standards of the Russian Army. And two of the principal causes of their unfitness are skeletal weakness from childhood calcium deficiency and muscular weakness from long-term vitamin deficiency. Combined then with these kids growing up in a society in which Russia is the only developed country among the 22 identified by the United Nations as having epidemic tuberculosis. 10% of the population of Russia is TB positive. Anyone going to prison in Russia comes out TB positive, 100%. Russia has chronically high levels of hepatitis B and C. 1/7 of the adult population of Russia are deemed to be clinically alcoholic. And I'm not just talking people who are boozers, I'm talking people who are hospital level alcoholic. Other disease, sexually transmitted diseases, and then the one that is becoming a big problem, HIV/AIDS. Russia has the highest rate of increase of HIV infection in the world. Not the highest rate of infection, the highest rate of increase. And what differentiates Russia, and in this case also Ukraine and Belarus, from the rest of the world is that everywhere else in the world, HIV infections are spread across the age demographic, so that roughly 3/4 of infections are above the age of 30. It's essentially a middle-aged disease in most countries. In Russia, 80% of infections are below the age of 30, which is to say, in the next generation of Russian parents. And the HIV infection comes overwhelmingly from one source, intravenous drug usage, because heroin addiction is rampant among young people in Russia. It was only last year that for the first time we're starting to see a significant jump of HIV infections through sexual transmission, which leads many people who deal with this issue to think that a new wave of infection is coming. What you have is a lot of young people who are the product of childhood diseases, who are themselves TB positive, often HIV positive, who have skeletal weaknesses, who are alcoholic, and these are supposed to be the parents of the next generation of Russians. Now, I could go on this theme for a long time. I haven't even begun to tell you how bad it really is. I emphasize it because people go to Moscow and St. Petersburg and they look at the reflection of all of this oil and gas money, and they think that this is a really successful, booming, powerful, rich country. It's not. Russia is a country which has an for its size of its population, extraordinarily large number of billionaires and multimillionaires. What it lacks, however, is a normal middle class. Because 80% of the people who are deemed to be middle class in Russia are civil servants and their families. They're basically people who are on the public payroll. That is not what we would think of as a middle class. This is a country which outside of a few major urban centers has deep-seated illnesses, which I want to emphasize go back a long way. Infant mortality rates started going up, life expectancy started going down when Khrushchev was still in power. This is not things that happened because the Soviet Union fell apart. These are things that have been developing for decades in the Soviet Union. And what this has created is really a contrast. And this is basically what the picture I want to leave you with, of a country which, because of global oil prices, has the wherewithal for its new generational ruling elite, who are mostly educated, intelligent, nationalist people who feel very strongly that it's important that their country play an important role in the world and be respected and even feared in the world. And a people who are profoundly cursed by the legacy of 7 decades of Soviet misrule, and for whom the needs are enormous. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering, well, why aren't they using some of this money to deal with these problems? And the answer is they're talking about doing so. But if you look at what have they done with the money so far, it's interesting. I mean, one thing that may reassure you and may surprise you is they have not been putting much of the money into the military. Despite a lot of rhetoric, very little actually real increase in buying power has gone into the Russian military. Most of it has barely kept pace with inflation. They haven't even replaced the conventional weaponry that they lost in the war in Chechnya. And the size of their strategic nuclear forces are definitely in long-term decline. And the quality of the manpower and the officer corps is still in serious long-term decline. What they've basically done with the money is 2 things. They've paid off Russia's external debts, which actually makes some sense because they thereby reduce debt burden and interest payments. But mostly what they've done with the money is for this ruling elite to create a very large series of vertically integrated political, economic, commercial combinations to dominate those parts of the Russian economy which make money, oil, gas, weapons export, a few other things, and to put themselves in position of control of those for their own benefit and, as I'm sure they would themselves quite sincerely think, for the long-term benefit of their own country, i.e. to contribute to Russia's greatness as a state. Putin has announced a new program of what he calls the 4 national projects in education, health, housing, and infrastructure, which are supposed to start dealing with some of these problems that I have been enumerating, but a lot of other problems I haven't even mentioned. My problem with this is twofold. One, it's been a long time coming and they're only now even talking about it. And second, as someone who lived in Brezhnev's Soviet Union and dealt with Soviet 5-year plans and grandiose projects and declared programs of reform, I'm more than a little skeptical that this is going to we're going to see very much out of this. I have no doubt a lot of money will be spent. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a lot of real product from it. Because, one thing, even I was saying this when I was in the embassy in the early 90s, something the United States could have done at that time. For not a whole lot of money, you could give a vitamin supplement to every school child in the country. And you could deal with a lot of these, childhood vitamin deficiency problems. They're not even doing that. But the image I want to leave you with is as a dichotomy. Russia as a restored great state that will certainly pursue its greatness, particularly when it feels itself not being treated with respect by other great powers, particularly by the United States, and will look for opportunities to assert its role, its power, its greatness, even if this seems in some instances to be counterproductive to its own interests. But that is as a superstructure on top of a society in which it is the nation itself that is at risk. A country that may have a population by the middle of the century 30 or 40 million less than it is today. Of a country that is deeply weak, and that a series of problems that are so great that in the same way that they are the force that brought about the breakup of the Soviet Union, could, in the not too distant future, not in the next few years, but in the next few decades, lead to a similar systemic crisis that could lead to an internal breakup of Russia itself. And I think that may happen in our lifetime. So on that note, see, the most interesting part of these evenings for me is your views and your comments and your questions, and I hope there'll be a lot of them. Because you're recording this, I am going to have to repeat people's questions since there's not a microphone to go around, but see, the gentleman on the side has his hand up. The question is about the Russian space program and the use of civilians as in their cosmonauts. Both countries do that. I mean, we send civilians up, they send civilians up, other countries send civilians up as part of the International Space Station program. This is certainly something where the Russians feel very strongly that they're operating on a level of parity with the United States. And in fact, a few years from now, when the space shuttle program is retired, and there's going to be at least a 5-year gap before its replacement is in operation, access to the International Space Station is going to be exclusively on Russian boosters. Americans are going to go to the International Space Station courtesy of the Russians for at least 5 years and maybe a good deal longer, depending on how much you think NASA is going to be able to get that replacement program operational on time and on budget. But this is an area in which it's increasingly difficult for me to see what other than prestige Russia actually acquires from the International Space Station project. It's something in which they do get some contracts from some other countries, but they make a lot more money from launching commercial satellites for other countries on a contract basis. I think for them, manned space flight, as it is for us and as for the Chinese, is about status more than it is about science. The questions are about U.S.-Russian relations, particularly the proposal to put the U.S. anti-ballistic missile forces in Europe, and Russian efforts to reform the Organization of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. Well, we could be here for a while just dealing with those issues. The Russian concern about European security mechanisms, the expansion of NATO, their changed view of the European Union, which they originally regarded as relatively benign in its eastern expansion and no longer do. Really, I think it reflects their notion of Russia being left out of an enormously growing, maturing, and successful entity to its west, and that Russia will essentially be left out of Europe and not taken seriously by Europe. That its relationship with Europe would be essentially that of, say, Venezuela to the United States as a supplier of hydrocarbons and illegal immigrants and things like that, and little more. And this sense of Derezhovnost would regard that really as intolerable. On the other hand, they refuse to try to participate in the European state system as one state among many, or even as one of a limited number of great European powers. They insist on being treated on a level of parity with all of Europe, which is intrinsically preposterous. So there's a contradiction there. I think their attitude toward the U.S. proposal to put ballistic missile defenses in Eastern Europe is to some degree understandable and to some degree paranoid. They don't believe for a minute that it would be limited to 10 launchers. They don't believe for a minute that the radars would be looking just at Iran. Anything that's that close to their western border they regard as affecting their own security. This is partly because of a suspicious mind, and it's partly because that's the way almost any country looks at its security. I mean, if we were in their shoes, I think our rhetoric would be pretty much the same. I think I was not involved in the diplomacy on this, but having worked for several years in the part of the Pentagon where these ideas come up with, I know that their idea of consultation is basically to inform people of what we've already decided we're going to do. And that frequently does not come across to another party as consultation. The Russian attitudes towards OSCE and CFE, which are the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe and the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, I think reflect a notion that these mechanisms which were created during the Cold War, when they were basically mechanisms between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, in which there was a degree of balance, are now ones in which there's an imbalance that is unfavorable to Russia. And that the activities of these mechanisms are ones which do not necessarily serve Russia's interests, and which often reflect on Russia's sense of pride and Russia's sense of being treated as an equal. And much of it is a reflection of that. Their attitude on the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, I think, is also a reflection of the fact that they were not the country that started the process of eroding the whole fabric of Cold War era arms control treaties. We did. You know, on the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We were the country that started unilaterally defining those as having been out of date. And the Russians, I think, attitude is, that's a game any number can play. But I think fundamentally what they are reflecting is a broad concern that European integration and the integration of former countries of the Warsaw Pact, both into NATO and more importantly into the European Union, is one that is essentially redefining what is Europe in ways that will leave the Eastern Slavic countries, particularly Russia, more or less out. And that is something which they are combating. They're doing it in ways that are tending to have exactly the opposite effect in European governments and in European public opinions, of communicating to Europeans that these people really aren't European and really are on the outside. The question is about, am I describing in the Russian economy as being supply side? I have to stop and think about that for a minute. See, I was, from my sins, trained in economics. That was decades ago, before people talked in supply side terms, as sort of pre-capitalist, as being more inspired by the nature of the economics of a Colbert in the France of Louis XIV, or the way the economy of Russia was organized under Catherine the Great. Now, keep in mind that there are a lot of countries, particularly countries which are commodity exporters, in which these sectors of the economy are run by the state. I mean, Mexico does. Norway does. Indonesia does, Saudi Arabia does. This is not unusual when a country doesn't have a lot that's competitive to sell, that it puts that limited benefits that it has under direct state control, sometimes under indirect state control. Lots of countries do that. Texas did in the 1920s. The Texas Railroad Commission was basically created to exercise government authority over the oil industry in Texas. That's not unusual. What you have in Russia is, I think, a more systematic organization of economic wealth, production, and finance, very tightly interlinked with politics, so that people who are on the government payroll, people who are senior officials of the Russian government, people in the Kremlin, are on the boards of directors of these economic entities. In fact, they're often chairman of the boards of directors. So that the distinction between political power and economic power has completely evaporated in a way that would not be true in Mexico or in Norway. That strikes me as certainly not Soviet, but in many ways sort of, the France of Louis XIV. It's very, to me, it's mercantilist. These terminologies may not elucidate very much. But I'm not sure. I would have to think a while before saying whether I really regard it as supply side. Let me have some time on it, sir. The question is about Ukraine and Russian attitudes towards Ukraine and what would happen if Ukraine were to face membership in the European Union or NATO. Most Russians really have a hard time thinking of Ukraine as a separate country. I mean, the origins of Russian culture were what's called Kievan Rus. The origins of Christianity in Russia were in Kiev. That was the center of Russian culture long before it was in Moscow. It is very, very difficult for most Russians to think of Ukrainians as being that much different. On the other hand, they have a tendency of talking down to them, of condescending to them, in much the same way that the Czechs used to do with the Slovaks, and then they were very shocked when the Slovaks finally said, "We've had enough of this. We would rather have our own country. Goodbye." I think that the ability of, and keeping in mind that the way the borders of post-Soviet Ukraine are drawn, an enormous minority of the population of that country are Russians, ethnically and linguistically. The whole eastern third of the country is much more Russian than it is Ukrainian. In fact, there was a debate, a brief debate in Ukraine at the time of independence as to whether the country might be healthier to lop off that eastern third and give it back to Russia. Of course, they didn't do that. But it was at least people recognized that the center of gravity of Ukraine is heavily to the east rather than to west, and it affects identity. And ultimately, Ukraine faces in both directions. And no Ukrainian government that tries to be too pro-Western or too pro-Russian can succeed, because it has to face in both directions. I know that among many Ukrainians, there is a goal of entry into NATO and entry into the European Union. I don't think I'm going to live long enough for them to qualify for entry in the European Union. Which is this is about, has to do with the future of the European Union, which is a different topic. I think the Russians would go to very great lengths to prevent Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And frankly, I don't see much benefit either to Europe or to the United States that it should become so. There are other viewpoints on this. I should say in candor that I am a person who's published articles and have another one coming out in the spring, which I question the need for the continued existence of NATO, which I think has long since outlived its utility and is becoming more a problem in the transatlantic relationship than an asset. But coming back to Russia and Ukraine, if you had told me in the late 1980s that Ukraine would break away from Russia and become an independent state without a single drop of blood being shed, I would have told you were crazy. I think the peaceful independence of Ukraine and that relationship, for all of the difficulties in it, has been peaceful now for 17 years, is essentially one of the wonders of the modern world. I mean, the breakup of the Soviet Union was not a continental Yugoslavia. It might have been. It wasn't, because there were some responsible people did responsible things rather than doing irresponsible things. I still think it's one of the wonders of the world in my lifetime. I actually think that the independence of Ukraine is more or less permanent. I don't see it ever becoming in an actual union with Russia again. But again, for many Russians, this is a very, very difficult thing to accept. But then I know a lot of Swedes who still haven't accepted the independence of Norway. Sir, the question is whether or not Russia's population decline might be transformed into something positive. because of the general problem of global overpopulation. I think the problem with this is that if Russia could deal with a lot of these health issues, their goal would be to get the population to go up, not to stabilize. Any Russian government would prefer a larger population rather than a smaller one. That's partly because there's a lot of concern that they will lose the ability to control some of the outlying parts of the Russian Federation in the decades ahead, particularly the Russian Far East, which has experienced dramatic loss of population. If you're going to try to stabilize a population, it's something you need to do rather slowly over time. I mean, Mao's one-child policy was an effort to stabilize China's population, and it's doing that, but it's creating humongous negative side effects, huge side effects. I mean, particularly in the gender imbalance, which is a danger of enormous consequences. The Russians' ability to somehow manage this issue, I think, goes far beyond their capacity as a public policy entity. And the problem is that their crises in their population are so acute that they're trying just to, they're going to have difficulties keeping above water. For example, Russian Ministry of Labor has identified that 2007, this year, is the year when the active labor force is starting to go down. And they're estimating that in the years to come, decades to come, Russia would have to have an increase in labor productivity of 6 to 8% a year just to compensate for the reduction in the size of its labor force. Now, when the United States has an increase of 3%, this is regarded as one of the wonders of the world. The reality is that labor productivity is barely budging in Russia, let alone going up by 6 to 8% a year. So that in reality, the ability of the Russian economy just is to maintain its level of output is going to go down. And as the Russian oil fields reach depletion, which they're going to do in the next 10, 12, 15 years, Russia's going to cease to be an oil exporter, as is Iran and is Mexico. Its sources of external revenue are going to be pretty much natural gas, of which will be very important. But Russia's ability to manage this kind of thing, I think they're going to be dealing with challenges that are so difficult that I think the kind of thing you suggest, while in a sense you might try to say, this isn't, let's take a crisis and make it into an opportunity. I think it's beyond. I think it's not only beyond their capacity. I think it's beyond any government's capacity. I mean, could I imagine my own government being able to do that? No. The question is about quality of life of Russians, and particularly of those who were reduced to near destitution at the period of the breakup of the Soviet Union. I remember many of the women you described. I used to actually deliberately carry rubles, bills of certain denomination in my outer pocket that I could give to women who were begging. I never gave money to men unless they were cripples, but I always give it to the old women. Your question is, where are those women now? They're dead. No joke. I mean, most of them have died under circumstances of genuine penury. And this was the generation of women, who lost all of their menfolk in the war and who rebuilt the country with their bare hands in the late 40s and 50s, and whose lives have been such an appalling nightmares, and then at the very end they get hit again. I mean, the tragedy of that generation of Russian women just makes me want to weep. What you didn't see in a place like the then Leningrad, or anybody would see now in Moscow or a lot of other places, is just how dreadful most Russian cities are. Industrial places that have, it's no one, in a sense, it's no wonder that the men are drinking themselves to death. If I had to live in a place like that, I probably would too. Quality of life issues are, the very term, I'm trying to think, what does that mean? How would you express that in Russian? It's just not a concept that people think about. at the same time that you have just truly obscene levels of waste of money by the new rich. And I mean just obscene levels. I mean, a man who already owns the second and third largest yachts in the world is building another one to be the biggest because Paul Allen built one that was now the biggest, so he's got to have one. The other, the other one only had 2 helipads. This one have 3 helipads. I mean, just ridiculous levels of expense. I was in Russia in July with a delegation for about 10 days, and I was embarrassed at the level of consumption that we were having. I was actually embarrassed at the luxury that we were having, because I know a lot of Russians and I know how average people live. But that's nothing new. I mean, you go back and you read about the time of Peter the Great, or the early 19th century. You would get that enormous contrast between the lavish, excessive lifestyles of the aristocracy and the dirt poverty of the serfs. I think this is something that largely continues, because if you look at socioeconomic indicators, those that are used by the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, IMF, USAID, EBRD, any of these things, with the single exception of education, by every other economic indicator, Russia's a third world country. Russia's a third world country, and in many respects not even doing very well by third world standards. And in fact, all the countries of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the 3 Baltic states, are all actually third world countries. Some of them doing much worse than Russia. One of the things that's happened that is not very well recognized is the extent to which the Russian oil fields are basically manned by migrant labor from other parts of the former Soviet Union, places like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, many of them illegal, who are very greatly exploited. But a number of those countries survive off of remittances, in the same way that Central American countries survive off of remittances from people working in this country. Today, you actually have more people from the Central Asian countries working in Russia than was true during the Soviet Union. Many of those countries are more dependent on Russia today than when they were in one country. But the conditions under which many of those migrant workers live and work is really appalling. The questions about the Russian role in the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict and Iran, well, that's a big topic. The Karabakh dispute, which is the territorial dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan, is one in which the Russians basically have equities on both sides. And they traditionally in the Caucasus, boy, I'm going to have to simplify here. Traditionally in the Caucasus, Armenia has historically been an ally, strategic ally of Russia. This is true. It's been true for 300 years. There's nothing new about this. And that role continues into the present day. The Armenians also have very good relations with Iran, partly because there are more Azeris living in northwestern Iran than there are Azeris living in Azerbaijan, and the Iranian government is worried about Azeri separatism. So even though both Azerbaijan and Iran are Shia, the Iranians are more on the side of the Christian Armenians. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Russian role on this for a long time was to they've had fairly bad relations with Azerbaijan, but after the succession from Haidar Aliyev to his son Ilham Aliyev, basically the father, before he died, he made a deal with Putin to guarantee the succession of his son. So relations between Azerbaijan and Russia now are quite good. So the Russians are taking sort of a balancing role on that. They really have no self-interest in seeing the dispute successfully resolved. But they also have absolutely no interest in having the dispute resume into an armed conflict, become a war again. So in a sense, I'd say, they're helping to manage the problem, but not to solve it. I would say that in many respects, and some of my former colleagues in the State Department would be irate at my saying this, that's basically what we're doing too. Because the United States has basically equities on both sides. And I think we're helping more to manage the problem than to solve it. Iran is a different question there. I mean, there's a lot of historical bad blood between Persians and Russians. But today, the fundamental thing that Iran and Russia have in common is a shared perception that the real challenge in the international state system is what they see as the disproportionate concentration of power and influence in one place, the United States. And the Russians have no desire to see a nuclear-armed Iran. The Russians also have even less desire to see American initiation of military action against Iran. They don't want to see another American war on their periphery. So in that respect, the Russians are trying to be to some degree helpful, but for their own purposes. They also don't believe that the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran is anywhere near as imminent as some people in Washington think it is. That's a subject on which, I don't have enough knowledge of the substance to have any idea how close the Iranians may or may not be. In fact, I think it's unlikely that the Russians have any clear idea either. But what the Russians want is essentially to help manage the problem, but they also feel that they are not getting very much in return from Washington. I mean, the Russians are great believers in quid pro quo, i.e. if we do something for you, you should do something for us. Their perception is that Washington always wants them to do something for them and never do anything in return. And that perception may not be entirely lacking in reality. Kosovo is going to declare unilateral independence after the 10th of December. The Russians have for a long time argued that separating Kosovo from Serbia is essentially no different than separating a territory called Abkhazia from Georgia. Abkhazia is a territory of western Georgia where, this is a complex history, but basically in the immediate time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Georgian nationalists tried to ethnically cleanse the Abkhaz. The Abkhaz turned to the Russians, and then they ethnically cleansed the bejesus out of the Georgians. There's a lot of victimization and guilt on both sides, and I'm not trying to portray this as good guys and bad guys, but I think there's a very reasonable prospect that what will happen in terms of the aftermath of Kosovo unilateral declaration of independence will be an effort by Abkhazia to seek inclusion in the Russian Federation, i.e. to be accepted as part of the Russian Federation. Part of the problem here is that for a long time, the Russians were telling the West, including Washington, that they were serious about the problem of Kosovo. And they weren't that warning was not taken very seriously. And now I think they feel that their sort of sense of pride is involved. I don't think the Russians care really that much about Serbia. I think the notion of some kind of an orthodox, spiritual link is very tenuous. What the Russians care very deeply about is that there not be a fundamental decision made about the territorial divisions of the Balkans at which their views are not taken seriously into account. And that's what they feel has happened, is that this is being done without consideration of their views and their interests. And in reaction to that, I think they may do something very serious in the Caucasus, and I think that could become a very serious challenge within just a few weeks. The question is about development of political opposition in Russia, presumably why it is now so weak, and how the institutions have tended to solidify power in the hands of the new ruling elite. I mean, that's partly, I would say, because of what most Russians would perceive as the failure of Western liberalism in Russia in the 1990s. The failure of what some people might think of as a democratic experiment, failure of multi-party democracy, failure of models which were imported from the West into an environment in which they didn't really have much fertile soil, and in which expectations of them were very unrealistically high. And those expectations were unrealistically high both in Russia and in the West. And the inability of many people who were advocates of kind of a liberal, here I'm using liberal in the European sense, not in the American sense, a form of economic organization, market economy, without first creating a rule of law state within which it functions. I mean, people forgetting that the basis of capitalism is not money, the basis of capitalism is enforceable contract. And without that, I mean, it just didn't work. There is a very, very widespread view in Russia that the experiments of the 1990s were not only a failure, but were in some sense a conspiracy against Russia. That, and particularly many of the American-sponsored programs are looked back on not as just as things that failed, but as that you Americans did this deliberately to weaken us. Not that we screwed up, but that we did it maliciously and intentionally to make Russia weak. This means that people who are associated with those kinds of policies in Russia have very, very little public resonance, very little credibility. And what it does mean is that though that group of people who, I think, as I said at the beginning, consider themselves to be reformers, not westernizing reformers, but Russifying reformers, who had the great good luck to have vast oil and gas revenues at their disposal, have now a great deal of credibility. I mean, they can point to this, that, and the other. I mean, there are all these other problems that are waiting, but they can point to things like, for example, I was in Moscow when Russia was given the Winter Olympics in 2012. I mean, this was an enormous deal. This was regarded very broadly as an example that Russia is back. Russia is now accepted. Russia is at a Western level. Russia is at a parity with the Americans. Russia gets an Olympic Games. That means that we are back. Frankly, why any country would want the Olympics beats me. But you know, these prestige is a lot more important to countries than we sometimes imagine. I mean, the British and the French, practically had a shootout to get the Summer Olympics. And the loss of it was regarded in France as a great national disgrace and in the British as a great national triumph. So it's not just the Russians. But I think in Russia that political opposition will develop again. But it will first develop as factionalism within ruling elites. And then we'll branch out. But the problem is that as long as it is clear that if you leave that elite and become overtly opposition, as a former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov did, for example, or as a former economic advisor to Putin, Illarionov did, then you become marginalized. When it's clear that if you go outside into the overt political arena to exercise opposition, that you then are essentially neutered, that tends to persuade people to stay within the ruling elite and have the oppositions operate as factionalism within that. And don't believe for a minute that these guys are completely unified and all love each other, and that Putin sits on top of a mechanism of control in which he can get anything he wants. No. He has to do politics just like any other politician anywhere else. But what it means is that opposition takes forms that tend to be out of sight. Doesn't mean that opposition isn't there. I mean, I've never known any political system that didn't have opposition. It just is where it is. And I think that's what we're going to see in Russia for some time. Oh, Chechnya. We lost our external empire with the Warsaw Pact. We lost the Soviet Union. If we don't draw the line somewhere, Russia itself will break apart. Now, I argued to Russians that I knew that Chechnya was genuinely sui generis, The Chechens were not representative of other Muslim peoples in the Russian Federation. Nobody else, the Tatars didn't want to copy them. Nobody in Adygea wanted to copy them. In Dagestan, the Chechnya was sui generis. But their view was, this is the beginning of the unraveling of the fabric of Russia herself, and we have to draw a line. Beyond that was an enormous fund of fundamental racism and a tendency to believe that issues of this kind can be dealt with by massive applications of violence. And forgetting that the Chechens really are enormously stubborn people and historically always have been. I think fundamentally the Chechens between the two wars had an opportunity for genuine autonomy, perhaps not independence, but autonomy, and then their own internal inability to function together, their own factionalism, threw that opportunity away. I think the Chechens had one great opportunity to win and they blew it themselves. And then came the second war. I think now that the Chechens have lost that opportunity at least for a generation, maybe for half a century or a century. But Chechnya remains a tragedy. I mean, the violence hasn't stopped. In fact, the violence is spreading to other parts of the Northern Caucasus, Ingushetia, Adygea, Ossetia, Dagestan, other places. This is traditionally a very violent part of the world, like the Balkans are. I was at a briefing a few days ago on the subject of Ingushetia, in which a representative of basically an Ingush human rights organization began by describing her people, the Ingush, who live just next door to Chechnya, as, "We are a warrior people." It's the first time I've ever heard a human rights spokesman use that as a term of praise.
Oh my goodness.
Problems of the Northern Caucasus are ones that are so much complex. They make the Balkans and the Middle East look easy. They make,